There's no question that the toppling of Yanukovych was the precipitating event, right, of the crisis. But let me tell you how I think about how Western policy led to the Ukraine crisis. My argument is that our goal was to make Ukraine and Georgia part of the West, okay? And to make Georgia and Ukraine part of the West, let's focus on Ukraine. We did three things. One, NATO expansion. Two, EU expansion. And three, the Orange Revolution. Okay, there's those three things together. And my argument is that the real key to alienating the Russians was NATO expansion. I believe that if there had been no NATO expansion and it was just EU expansion, that it would not have caused a major crisis with the Russians. I think the Russians would have been willing to live with EU expansion into Ukraine. It's NATO expansion plus EU expansion plus the Orange Revolution. It's those three things together, all designed to make Ukraine and also Georgia with the Rose Revolution part of NATO. Now, the crisis in February 2014 that I've talked about a number of times, as this gentleman points out, was precipitated by the overthrow of Yanukovych. But the crisis actually started over EU expansion. It was not over NATO expansion, it was over EU expansion. So in a way, you could say what happened in February not only had little to do with NATO, it was EU expansion plus the Orange Revolution, which is linked with the overthrow of Yanukovych. I do not disagree with you that it was the overthrow of Yanukovych that precipitated the crisis. But the fact is that the deep cause of the crisis was the attempt to make Ukraine part of the West, to make it a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. And that involved NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the Orange Revolution. And the real key was NATO expansion, right? This is why, have you ever asked yourself, why did Putin take Crimea? There's no evidence that he was thinking about taking Crimea before February 22nd, 2014. Right? Why did he take it? Because his great fear was Yanukovych would be overthrown, a pro-Western leader would be installed in Ukraine, Ukraine would jump into bed with the West, and Sevastopol, which is a Russian naval base historically, and was being basically operated as a Russian naval base, but only with a lease from the Ukrainian government, would become a NATO base. This is not going to happen, right? This is not going to happen. So he took Crimea, in my opinion, to make sure that Sevastopol remained in Russia's hands, and it didn't fall into the hands of NATO. So I have no problem with your point about the importance of Yanukovych being overthrown on February 22nd, but I would put it into a broader context and emphasize the importance of NATO expansion. Now, his second question was, could NATO be transformed where you have an alliance between the United States on one hand and an EU military capability on the other hand? And I think that's not going to happen because you already have NATO, and why would you want to fool around with NATO? Why is creating an EU military capability a good thing? What does it do to make the West's military capability any more robust? I don't think it does much of anything. The other thing is, and I don't want to get into this in any detail at this point in time, The EU is in political trouble these days, and it's not clear that the EU can get its act together and create a common military force that could ally itself with the Americans. I think if you're interested in keeping the Americans in Europe, you don't want to fool around with the existing NATO structure. Just leave it in place. This woman right here? No, I'll get you next.
Thank you, Professor. So you used an official statement of Madeleine Albright to argue that NATO was not extending towards Central and Eastern Europe to counteract the Russian aggression.
Yes.
Nevertheless, the Central and Eastern states were joining NATO to take shelter in the case of a foreign/Russian aggression, and they were accepted. NATO said yes, you are okay to join the alliance. So do you see here a contradiction between what NATO is saying and what NATO is doing?
Yeah. Her point, which is a very interesting point, is that NATO, according to me, is interested in expanding eastward, not to counter the Russians, right? Not to form a military alliance against Russia that prevents it from conquering Eastern Europe. It's pursuing a policy of liberal hegemony. However, she says, the East European countries like Poland and Romania that are joining NATO view NATO as an alliance that will protect them against Russian aggression, which is in opposition or contradicts what I was saying about what NATO is up to. I think you're absolutely right that the countries in Eastern Europe were thinking in realpolitik terms. My point to you is that the people who were driving NATO expansion in the West, and that includes the United States and the West Europeans, were not thinking about it in realpolitik terms. They didn't view Russia as a serious threat. You want to remember, I mean, this may not seem plausible to you, but you want to remember that, first of all, in the 1990s, Russia was not a serious military threat to Eastern Europe. And you ought to spend a little time thinking about what Russian military deployments looked like in the western military districts of Russia on February 22nd, 2014. There are hardly any Russian forces in the western districts. Russia does not present a threat to Eastern Europe in February 2014. We're not worrying about a Russian attack into Eastern Europe. I know the East Europeans worry about this because it's in their DNA, right? I understand that. And I'm not, if I were Romanian or Polish, it would be in my DNA, right? I have the luxury of having grown up in the most secure great power in the history of the world. You don't. But what I'm telling you is NATO expansion was driven by the likes of Madeleine Albright. You should just go home and Google Madeleine Albright's views on NATO expansion as a threat to Russia. Right? And my final point, just in response, is you do not want to underestimate what a thoroughly liberal country the United States is. And how, at the end of the Cold War, when we were the Unipole, we were in a position, right, to spread liberal democracy and the American way of life with a West European way of life around the planet, or at least we thought we could do that.